Hey class, welcome to chapter 7 of our text, which this chapter is about psychopathy. Hopefully, as you read this chapter, you find it as interesting as I do. And we're just going to talk a little bit about what is a psychopath and all the different research that has been done into factors that play into having somebody meet the criteria to be considered a psychopath. So you've probably heard the term psychopath. I think oftentimes it's something that's related to serial killers, and when you think of, the very criminally insane or criminally the big cases that you hear about, oftentimes that's what we think about when we think of a psychopath. Interesting differentiations in our text about different kinds of psychopaths, and also how psychopaths vary from terms like sociopath and also antisocial personality disorder, which is what the diagnosis given in the DSM-5 is for somebody who can. Some of the criteria are the same, and as we're going to talk about, some of them aren't the same. So, first of all, a differentiation between a psychopath and a sociopath. A sociopath is attached to somebody who persistently and chronically breaks the law. And when we think about a true psychopath, a psychopath may or may not engage in criminal or antisocial behavior. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Again, when we think about a psychopath, we often are thinking of, like I said, a serial killer, somebody who's in prison for, committing heinous crimes. And important to remember that that is not always the case for a psychopath. So the term psychopath is currently used to describe a person who demonstrates a discernible cluster of psychological, interpersonal, and neurophysiological features that distinguish that person from the general population. One of the quotes here in your text about psychopaths, that they are social predators who charm, manipulate, and ruthlessly plow their way through life, leaving a broad trail of broken hearts, shattered expectations, and empty wallets. Completely lacking in conscience and empathy, they selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt or regret. Further breaking this down, we have a primary psychopath, secondary, and a dissocial psychopath. So a primary psychopath is a true psychopath. This person has certain identifiable psychological, emotional, cognitive, and biological differences that distinguish the person from the general and criminal populations. Secondary psychopaths commit antisocial or violent acts because of severe emotional problems or inner conflicts. They are sometimes called acting out neurotics, neurotic delinquents, symptomatic psychopaths, or simply emotionally disturbed offenders. Also, research indicates that these secondary psychopaths demonstrate more impulsivity and emotional instability than the primary psychopath. And then the dissocial psychopaths display aggressive, antisocial behavior that they have learned from their subculture, like this would be like gangs, terrorist groups, or, their families. So in both these the secondary psychopath and the dissocial psychopath, the label psychopath is misleading because the behaviors and backgrounds have little, if any, similarity to those of primary psychopaths. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. And now sort of differentiating from antisocial personality disorder. So antisocial personality disorder, as I said, it's a diagnosis provided by the DSM-5, which is what we practicing mental health clinicians use to diagnose mental health disorders. So antisocial personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15. Antisocial personality disorder always involves criminal behavior. It cannot be diagnosed to somebody who does not have criminal behavior. And this is sort of the main differentiation between antisocial personality disorder criteria and psychopathy. So the DSM-5 does state that antisocial personality disorder has also been referred to as psychopathy, sociopathy, or dissocial personality disorder. Important for us to remember that the features with psychopathy are not the same as antisocial personality disorder. And again, kind of the criminal behavior is one aspect of the differentiation. The also thing that's really important to keep in mind is, as we're going to discuss further in this chapter, there are cognitive and biological impairments that a true psychopath has and deals with that somebody with antisocial personality disorder might not, because a personality disorder can be in response to upbringing and severe trauma and sort of maybe more like the dissocial psychopaths that we just talked about. So kind of think about that when we're talking about the differences here. So some behavioral characteristics of psychopaths. They have superficial charm. When you think about superficial charm, that they can keep on, kind of a superficial conversation and make people feel charmed by them, but only on that superficial level, not a lot of depth there. Average to above average intelligence. I think oftentimes, again, psychopaths can be portrayed in movies and such as being, highly intelligent. That's not always the case, although they usually do have at least average intelligence. Often friendly and outgoing, and have many interests and are verbally skillful. So when we're talking about verbally skillful, we're talking about somebody who has an extensive vocabulary and can, talk at length about certain topics, but actually doesn't have a lot of real substance in the way that they are talking about things, and can end up in conversations, maybe people notice that they kind of talk in circles, or maybe they use these sort of like stock phrases, repeatedly to make themselves kind of sound more engaged in conversation or intelligent, and really, there, like I said, there's not much substance. They can also have logically inconsistent statements and phrases and half-formed sentences. And as we talk more about some differences in the executive function of a psychopath, it might start to make sense that they seem to kind of lack that central organization in their conversation and how they interact with the world. So psychopaths usually score higher on intelligence tests than the general population. Most do not exhibit severe mental health disorders. And when we're talking about psychopaths, we also I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the studies that have been done on psychopathy, of course, have been conducted with psychopaths who are incarcerated, since that's a population of people that is easily accessible and can be readily identified. Important to note that there are a lot of other psychopaths in the world who are textbook labels as successful, right? Who have probably not been caught. So I think that's interesting to keep in mind too when we're talking about the research that's been done. And also important to note that psychopaths who find themselves in desperate situations do die by suicide, especially if they're kind of that highly impulsive and violent type. So that's an important thing to note. Again, kind of differentiating a psychopath from somebody who has more of the narcissistic qualities, right? Who would probably never engage in suicidality because of that extreme sense of ego in a narcissist. A psychopath is a different category. Other principal traits of a psychopath, you can find this in your text. There's a really good table on page 213, kind of breaks down some behaviors. But other principal traits of psychopathy are selfishness, inability to love or gain affection, egocentricity, flat affect, little contact with family, disregard for truth, lack of remorse or guilt, and stimulation seeking. Oftentimes, psychopaths can be labeled as pathological liars because they really cannot understand the purpose of being honest unless it brings some kind of gain to their lives. Because again, remembering that a psychopath does not have a sense of remorse or guilt or kind of that ethical compass about right and wrong. A psychopath might admit guilt when they are caught in a criminal act. Usually that is because they enjoy kind of watching the expression of somebody when they do admit to kind of heinous wrongdoing. And again, as we're talking about this, just want to put this out there too. Much like any other disorder or even cognitive disorder, psychopathy does exist on a spectrum. So there's, people who have exponentially more traits of psychopathy. Probably those are the people who are committing the heinous crimes. And when we think of serial killers, that's what we're thinking about. There's a spectrum, though. So there are also psychopaths who are not engaging in quite the same level of heinous behavior. Again, thinking about high impulsivity, that can certainly be part of the reason that psychopaths are caught in their crimes, because usually we're not talking about people who can sit and plan things out for an extended period of time. There's usually an impulsive aspect and nature to their criminal behavior. So then we're going to kind of focus in here on the criminal psychopath. About 1% of the general population. These are the most violent and most persistent offenders with the highest rates of recidivism. Recidivism is the tendency to reoffend. So we're talking about criminal psychopaths' high rate of reoffending. Again, as we're going to talk more about also, but again, because part of this disorder is an inability to experience the same type of nervous system reaction or executive function that would create kind of that moral, ethical reasoning in somebody. So psychological measures of psychopathy, we have the psychopathy checklist, or the PCLR. This is the most frequently used instrument to measure psychopathy, and it assesses the affective, emotional, interpersonal, behavioral, and social deviance facets of psychopathy from various sources. One of the downfalls of this measure is that it may not identify psychopaths who don't engage in criminal behavior. And remember, again, that not all psychopaths are engaging in criminal behavior. It is estimated that in the adult prison population, so 1% of the general population, more like 15 to 25% of the prison population, is one number. Other researchers have reported more like 10 to 11%. So definitely higher percentage in the prison population than in the general population of psychopathy. So again, the PCLR was specifically designed to identify psychopaths already incarcerated. So that's why it may not do a great job at identifying psychopaths who are not engaging in criminal behavior. Some items included on the PCLR for ratings require information across multiple domains like behavior at work or school, behavior toward family, friends, and sexual partners, and criminal behaviors. Examiners, this is all a self-report scale, so then examiners take all of this information and score each item on a scale of 0 to 2, depending on the extent which an individual has the disposition described by each item on the checklist. So 0 is consistently absent, 1 is inconsistent, and 2 is consistently present. And scoring ends up being quite complex and requires, quite a lot of training. And a score of 30 or above on this PCLR generally is what will qualify somebody as meeting the criteria for a psychopath. Okay, so because researchers love to break things down and then break things down again and then break things down again, we're going to talk about core factors of psychopathy. So research done on the PCLR has made it clear that psychopathy is a multi-dimensional thing in nature. And so one statistical procedure designed to find different personality dimensions or behavioral factors in test data is factor analysis. This is a mathematical procedure used to make sense of a vast array of variables. The procedure usually produces a small number of descriptive or explanatory concepts called factors. When expert ratings of psychopathy on the PCLR were submitted to factor analysis, at least 2 behavioral dimensions or factors emerged. So we're going to talk about these factors. So first of all, there's the 2-factor scheme. And if we are talking about psychopathy having 2 factors, factor 1 reflects the interpersonal and emotional components of psychopathy and consists of items measuring remorselessness, callousness, and selfish use and manipulation of others. So the typical psychopath feels no compunctions about using others to meet his or her own needs. Factor 2 is most closely associated with a socially deviant or antisocial lifestyle, as characterized by poor planning, impulsiveness, an excessive need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, and a lack of realistic goals. Some factors have found that factor 1 appears to be associated with planned predatory violence, while factor 2 appears to be related to spontaneous and impulsive violence and substance abuse problems. Factor 1 is also linked to resistance and inability to profit from psychotherapy and treatment programs. And factor 2 appears related to socioeconomic status, educational attainment, and cultural ethnic backgrounds. Whereas factor 1 may be more connected to the biopsychological influences. Okay, so then research, then decided that the psychopathic behavior is maybe too diverse to be captured in only these two dimensions. So then, with increasing sophistication of statistical methods, contemporary research indicates that there may be at least 3 core behavioral or personality dimensions that best describe psychopathy. So then the third core factor also refers to the emotional shallowness, callousness, and lack of empathy characteristics of most psychopaths. Then we have the 4-factor model. So, in addition to disturbances in interpersonal affective and behavioral functioning, the definition of psychopathy should also include a 4th factor or dimension, which is antisocial behavior. So the 4-factor model has also been supported across various cultures, ethnic groups, young and adult offenders, and forensic patients. So this 4-factor model involves individuals manifesting psychopathic traits who often exhibiting violence and a large collection of other antisocial behavioral patterns that are more than just poor planning and impulsivity associated with factor 2. So, according to the 4-factor perspective, the factors are interpersonal, such as pathological lying and cunning; 2, lifestyle, such as irresponsible behavior, sensation seeking, and impulsiveness; 3, affective, shallow affect or emotional reactions, lack of remorsefulness for their actions; and 4, antisocial tendencies, such as poor self-regulation and a wide array of antisocial behavior, including delinquency. And then you'll see on your page 223 in your text, you have a nice table there that breaks down that 4-factor model. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead on this next slide. We also have the TRI-PM model, which is another model of psychopathy, and this is sometimes referred as the triadic psychopathy model. And this consists of 3 distinct dimensions: meanness or callous unemotionality, disinhibition or externalizing proneness, and boldness or fearless dominance. So that can be found on page 224 of your text, a table breaking down that model. Okay, so then in recent years, there has been some investigation into a group of personality clusters that are referred to as the dark triad. So psychopathy is one of these. The other 2 are Machiavellism and narcissism. So sort of those are the main 3. And then also maybe a 4th dark characteristic identified as everyday sadism. Machiavellism is master manipulation of others, and everyday sadism can be, someone trying to hurt you verbally or physically for pure enjoyment. So somebody who's a bully is an everyday sadist. Dark personalities do not invariably commit crime, but they are socially aversive and not likable. So like the primary psychopath, they may make a good first impression, and then, of course, like the more time is spent with somebody with this this cluster of traits, the less likable they are. So, psychopathy in females is less prevalent than males. They have lower scores on the PCLR. Not easy to categorize what kind of crime they commit. There's a wide range of crime, kind of instability in relationships, numerous marital relationships, and a lack of ability to make realistic long-term goals. Of course, as in most sciences and psychology studies, most of the study has been done on white men. So keeping that in mind too, that sort of paints a picture and colors the relevance of all of these studies for different groups of people, such as women and people who are not white. So female psychopaths do tend to be more subtle in their behavior and more skillful in their aggression, and in how they exploit people in their relationships, as well as how they can manipulate others. So many of their harmful acts are probably unnoticed by authorities, because it's a kind of a more subtle. Remember in our previous chapters when we were talking about kind of that difference in aggression between boys and girls, right? And that boys display kind of more of that physical outward aggression, and girls display more of that sort of underlying, more kind of insidious aggression. So the same thing is true here of the female versus the male psychopath. So then the question, can juvenile psychopathy be identified? So this is a tough question, because when we're thinking about the characteristics of a psychopath, and we think about the changes that teenagers can go through emotionally and how they interact with the world when they are going through puberty, I think that it can be a really difficult thing to kind of weigh out. So when we're thinking about teenagers who are acting with extreme selfishness and callousness, I think that probably that's not that uncommon. Also, another thing that can make this really challenging to identify psychopathy is that coping mechanisms in situations of abuse. So the way that a young person is interacting with the world and presenting as very callous and very tough and uncaring can absolutely be in response to growing up in a situation of abuse. I am certified in a specific type of trauma treatment for people, and when I was going through the training, one of the trainers said that he believes that one day every mental health diagnosis in the DSM, including the personality disorders, will be tied back to basically reactions to different forms of trauma. So I do think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also keeping in mind, what happens if you label a juvenile with such a hefty diagnosis as psychopathy, right? What does that young person then believe about themselves? How much of their later behavior is a self-fulfilling prophecy from being told that they have this sort of incurable, overwhelming mountain that they have to deal with, and that it really limits treatment options, because as we touched on, treatment outcomes for people with psychopathy are not good. So then also limiting treatment options for young people, and people probably maybe not necessarily wanting to work with them, and that sort of thing. So one thing about youth who demonstrate psychopathic characteristics, they also seem to be heavily involved in antisocial behavior. So that's something to keep in mind, as that's not always true, remember, with adult psychopaths. Okay, so now we're going to kind of get into the things that I think are just so interesting about psychopathy and the research that's being done to really identify what neurobiological factors could be at play in why somebody experiences things like anxiety and guilt in such a different manner than the general population. So the first thing that we're going to talk about as far as neurobiological factors and psychopathy are genetic factors. Some evidence does suggest that temperament linked to low arousal and fear responses is associated with psychopathy. So a temperament of this nature may disrupt the formation of guilt, conscience, or concern about punishment. And it also is suggested that youth with psychopathic features may have brain abnormalities. So think about when you're a little kid and you do something wrong and you get in trouble and you have that sense of guilt, and it makes you not want to do that thing again. Somebody who has psychopathy does not have that. They do not feel that reaction. So then it makes it very difficult to learn what is right and what is wrong. So then neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is the branch of psychology that combines neurosciences and psychology. Neuropsychological indicators called markers have been repeatedly found in psychopaths, as reflected in electrodermal, which is skin conductance measures, and cardiovascular and other nervous system indices. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about the nervous system. We already talked about this a little bit in chapter 3, and if you've taken general psychology, we definitely talked about it in that class. So when we're talking about the human nervous system, there are two major parts. So the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, so the CNS and the PNS, are the two principal parts. The CNS comprises the brain and the spinal cord, and the PNS comprises all the nerve cells called neurons and nerve pathways that are located outside the CNS. So in other words, those nerves that leave the spinal cord and brain stem and travel to specific sites in the body belong to that peripheral PNS outside nervous system. This includes all the nerves connecting the muscles, skin, heart, glands, and senses. So the basic function of the PNS then is to bring the outside information to the central nervous system where it is processed. Think about if you burn your finger, what's happening there is that the PNS is relaying the information back to the CNS to process that information, and then the CNS sends the command to the PNS to withdraw the finger. So it's all happening very quickly. So, central nervous system differences. So when we're talking about the human brain, I'm sure we all have heard that it can be divided anatomically into two cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left. For most individuals, the right hemisphere specializes in nonverbal functions, and the left specializes in verbal or language functions. The left also processes information in more of an analytical, sequential fashion, and the right hemisphere seems to process information more holistically and globally. So the right is involved in the recognition of faces, which is a complicated process, kind of requiring the processing of information all at once. So the right and the left are two functionally differentiated information processing systems. Also, these both cerebral hemispheres make different contributions to human emotions. The right hemisphere is particularly important in the understanding and communication of emotion, and the left seems to be closely tied to self-inhibiting processes, and the right is more spontaneous and impulsive. These two hemispheres must have a balance of contribution from each for normal judgment and appropriate self-control, and self-regulation of emotion. So, there is a hypothesis that criminal psychopaths manifest an abnormal or unusual balance between the two hemispheres, both in language processing and in an emotional or arousal states, called hemisphere asymmetry. Criminal psychopaths are often really inconsistent with their verbalized thoughts, feelings, and intentions. They seem to be highly peculiar in the organization of certain perceptual and cognitive processes. The left hemisphere seems deficient in linguistic processing because they do not rely on the verbal sequential operations to the extent that a majority of individuals do. And also, the hypothesis is that as the language task increases in complexity, non-psychopathic persons rely more and more on the left hemisphere to process the information, while psychopaths rely more on the right hemisphere. Other researchers have found evidence that psychopaths exhibit an emotional paradox. So that is that psychopaths demonstrate normal appraisal of emotional cues and situations in the abstract, like a verbal discussion, but they are deficient in using emotional cues to guide their judgments and behavior in the process of living. So psychopaths seem to be able to talk about emotional cues, but lack the ability to use them effectively in the real world. So this deficiency seems to be due to processing problems located in the left hemisphere. Studies have found that a high percentage of violent repetitive offenders have left hemispheric dysfunction. So then also the frontal lobe, which we've talked about before in previous chapters, being kind of the commander, being in charge of that executive functioning and that ability to differentiate between right and wrong and make all those long-term plans and sort of also, weigh out the moral and ethical and the consequences. All of that's taking place in that frontal lobe. So research has been consistent in demonstrating that prefrontal damage results in poor decision-making, reduced autonomic functioning, and a psychopathic-like personality. And there's a growing body of research that indicates that psychopaths do appear to have deficits in frontal lobe processing. And this, of course, may result in faulty impulse control, judgment, and planning. Now, when we go back to talking about successful versus unsuccessful psychopaths, probably the successful psychopaths have more frontal lobe functioning than the unsuccessful or more impulsive variety of psychopath. Obviously, psychopaths clearly demonstrate problems in emotional processing. As the frontal lobe is associated with this observation, but researchers are really beginning to also believe that the amygdala and hippocampus might also come into play. So several studies have revealed abnormal function and structure in the amygdala hippocampal complex in psychopathic individuals. So the amygdala is responsible for emotions such as fear, anger, and disgust. Each amygdala, there's one for each side of the brain, is located close to the hippocampus in the front portion of the temporal lobe. And some studies done have found that psychopaths exhibited lower amygdala activity during an emotional processing task when compared with criminal non-psychopaths and non-criminal control. Okay, so then looking more at that peripheral nervous system research and how it might come into play for the development of psychopathy. The PNS is subdivided into a somatic division, which comprises the motor nerves and innervate the muscles involved in body movement, and an autonomic division. And this is what controls the heart rate, gland secretion, and smooth muscle activities. So smooth muscles are muscles found in the blood vessels and gastrointestinal system. And research has uncovered a significant difference between the psychopaths and the general population's reactivity or responsiveness to stimuli. The autonomic division is especially important because that is what activates emotional behavior and responsivity to stress and tension. So then that autonomic can be subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So the sympathetic system is what kicks in fight or flight. So think of sympathetic nervous system as arousal, sort of a shot of adrenaline, that sort of thing that happens to tell your body to fight or flight, right? And then the parasympathetic system is what kicks into play after the danger is over. So when it's functioning correctly, it's a system where it gets you away from danger, and then the parasympathetic kicks in to kind of calm down that arousal and let your brain know that you are now safe. When we think about a psychopath, and we think about how psychopaths have that kind of low stress affect, even when there is a lot of stress happening. This could be because maybe the sympathetic nervous system does not react sufficiently to stressful stimuli, or that parasympathetic system is kind of coming into action in the psychopath more rapidly than in non-psychopaths. So again, whatever's happening, they're not experiencing that same level of alarm in their sympathetic nervous system. There is research to suggest support for either of those positions. So then we're going to talk about this low skin conductance arousal. So emotional arousal, which is largely under the control of the autonomic nervous system, can be measured by monitoring the system's activity. So think about heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration rate. The most commonly used physiological indicator of emotional arousal is the skin conductance response, also known as the galvanic skin response. And this is really a measure of the resistance of the skin to conducting electrical current. So perspiration seems to play a major role, and perspiration corresponds very closely to changes in emotional states and has been found to be a highly sensitive indicator of even slight changes in the autonomic nervous system. So other things being equal, as emotional arousal increases, perspiration rate increases proportionately, right? So a little bit of stress, a little perspiration, high stress situation, more and more perspiration. So this is what is being picked up and amplified on a polygraph test. An increase in perspiration lowers the skin resistance to electrical conductance. And so, that skin conductance is increasing as emotional arousal increases also. So interestingly enough, investigators have reported low skin conductance arousal in psychopaths. So again, kind of pointing to that deficits in this skin conductance arousal are associated with low autonomic arousal levels, which are related to low emotionality, lack of impact and remorse, and ability to lie easily. So, very interesting research there. So then kind of going back to what we were saying about that autonomic nervous system with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and that psychopaths appear to be both autonomically and cortically under-aroused. So again, that when we're talking about the learning process for somebody in what is right and wrong, and the importance of that feeling of anxiety, which is a nervous system response, when we do the wrong thing, and how that is what teaches our brain what is right and wrong. So without that, it would be very difficult to learn. And again, like when we're talking about psychopaths and their high rate of recidivism, right? Also hard for them to learn, because things that maybe they go through that we look at and think, oh my gosh, why would that person just keep doing that? Because they do not have that same level of nervous system reaction that's teaching them that it is bad. Interestingly enough, research has shown that if emotional arousal can be induced, psychopaths can learn from past experiences and avoid normally painful or aversive situations. So this has been, research has shown that injections of adrenaline into somebody who has psychopathy has greatly increased their ability to learn from their mistakes, learn from past experiences. So the idea being that injection of adrenaline is kind of alighting that nervous system and making that nervous system function in a more normal way. So childhood of the psychopath, there are some indicators early on. That something's amiss. And when we're talking about the psychopath, remember that we're not only talking about environmental stressors. We're talking about most likely the interaction between social, cultural influences and also some biological and genetic factors. So things in childhood that continue into adulthood, hyperactivity, impulsivity, attention problems and conduct problems, parental neglect, negative school experience, and that children who display, tendencies towards psychopathy early with the conduct disorders, as we've talked about before, kind of that snowball effect, can become life course persistent offenders. Life course persistent offenders manifest antisocial behaviors across all kinds of conditions and situations in their childhood. Neurologically, they demonstrate a variety of minor neuropsychological disorders like difficult temperaments as infants, attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity as children, and learning problems as adolescents. They are rejected by peers during their preteen years and are annoying to adults. They display virtually no empathy or concern for others, show very little bonding to family, and are often sadistic and manipulative, highly impulsive, and lack insight. Given all of that, though, only a very modest number of life course persistent offenders probably qualify as full-blown psychopaths. So treatment of criminal psychopaths. Research indicates that they are not responsive to treatment, which makes sense because of all of the things we have just been discussing. Also, because of the tendency towards manipulation, it can be very difficult to gauge if somebody with psychopathy is actually gaining anything from treatment or if they are sort of enjoying playing the game of manipulation to make it appear that they are gaining from treatment. Any studies that have shown any kind of treatment that is effective, it's been a very large dose of treatment. And again, just noting that most of this research that's been done on lack of effectiveness of treatment has been done on male psychopaths. So again, sort of limiting information about female psychopaths and their success in a treatment setting. So, unfortunately, little is known about the effectiveness of treatment of children and adolescents who are demonstrating psychopathic tendencies. Um, Important to note that it's just not going to be just any treatment setting that's going to be effective for treating children and adolescents, and that since there's such a distinct set of emotional and cognitive deficits, it really needs to be a treatment situation that is really specific and geared towards those issues. So important to note that any successful treatment has really been when a child or adolescent is sort of offered a reward for participating in treatment rather than the discipline. Because again, going back to what we were talking about the nervous system, remembering that discipline and the negative consequences are not going to affect somebody who has this setup towards psychopathy in the same way that it would affect somebody in the general population without these deficits. Okay, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I will look forward to talking to you again in a couple weeks. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.